I would love for you to just explain the concept of the inner child.
So, the inner child is a part of us. There was somebody who said that you are all of the parts of yourself, all of the ages that you've ever been, that is stored within you. And so, the inner child is the part of you that formed between birth and about 7 or 8 years old. When you're a child, you are completely reliant upon your caregiver. And your primary goal as a child is to develop and maintain a connection with that caregiver, because without that connection, you can't survive. And as you are going through your life at that age, you are picking up all of the feedback from your caregiver of what is appropriate and what's not appropriate, what is threatening that connection with your caregiver, and what brings your caregiver closer to you. And so, through that feedback from your caregivers, you learn what is expected of you, what's appropriate, what emotions are acceptable, and what's not acceptable. And any emotion that you subconsciously realized was unacceptable, or that your caregiver wasn't able to help you process the emotion in a healthy way, it kind of got shoved down in your body and it's stored in the inner child. And so now, as an adult, any situation that is similar or familiar to that inner child, you're going to react from that place of the inner child, from what you learned as a child, as opposed to consciously reacting as an adult.
Yeah. How you explain that makes it so clear about just some personal things that I've gone through. And they talk about trauma, big T, little t, and just those different things that kind of happen. And, something happened to me as a child that I always knew happened. And so I kept thinking, like, is there something that I didn't know that happened that I was like pushing deep down? And I ended up doing a theta healing session with a friend of mine. And that thing that I knew that happened came up, but I didn't realize that I never processed the
Mhm,
emotions from it. It wasn't that I
mhm,
couldn't remember what happened. It was like, oh, this is no big deal. This is just kind of a way that I think a lot of families do. A lot of times when something happens, you pass it off with humor.
mhm.
And so anytime I would think about this, ultimately I was accidentally dropped off at my house and my parents weren't there. I was about 4 years old. And it was scary. I
Mhm,
didn't know what to do and I hid. I think a lot of times people don't know how to handle their emotions. So their
mhm,
first reaction is to be like, oh, that was such a funny
mhm,
time. That session was like 2 hours long. I like bawled my eyes out the whole time.
mhm,
It was like my inner child was like, oh, you finally see me. I've been hiding
mhm,
in that closet because I ultimately hid. That's what I did in that time. And so that processing the emotions and learning how to do that. And that seems a little foreign for me for sure. And I've been working on that. A lot of times you don't realize how much it affects you
mhm.
until you have kids of your own.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
then when your kids get to the ages where you had a hard time, it
Mhm,
really sparks something inside of you where you're like, "Oh my gosh,
mhm.
I don't know how to deal with that." And so I would love to know your take on that age connection of your inner child and then your children's inner child.
Yeah, I had a therapist say that to me when I first started therapy. My therapist had said, as your child goes through the stages where you had some of your major and even the minor, the micro traumas happen, it's going to be very difficult. You're going to find that you're more emotionally reactive, that you have less of a handle, that you don't feel as grounded or certain in your parenting. And those are the times where you really have to turn inward to find out like what is going on here. And at the time when she said that, I was like, no, I know what happened. That's the other part about the inner child, is that you don't necessarily have to remember exactly what happened as a child, because the body does have a tendency to, if it was too overwhelming, too much for your system, it will block out the memory of the words. You won't be able to recall the words associated with it, but your body will remember the feeling that's associated with it. When my daughter was 6 years old, she was dancing in the living room. Like, she's just having a great time. And I was watching her dance, and all of a sudden I started bawling my eyes out. And I couldn't understand what was happening. Later on that day, I went and sat in meditation and I kind of grounded myself. And I realized that at 6 years old is when my parents got divorced. Now, that's not a major, major trauma. It was big change in my life as a 6 year old. And that was also the moment that I became the caregiver to my younger brothers, because my dad was gone and my mom needed to work multiple jobs to take care of us. And so I became the go to for my brothers. And I'm watching my daughter go through 6 years old, and I'm wondering, how was I taking care of 2 younger babies, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at that point, at 6 years old? And so that year of her life was incredibly difficult for me because I had to not only process the pain that was inside from having been left alone and responsible for my brothers, but also watching her live this life, this childhood that I never got to experience to be a kid, because that was the moment that I lost my childhood.
Wow, that's powerful. There's been some ways that people describe divorce, and it's ultimately a death. These two people have been together, and when you remove that as a child, especially because you've only known that to be the way, you're like, wait a second, here's a unit that's been together, whether it's healthy or not. And then you remove that. And so it's just also processing that and then having that pressure to be the person, the caregiver for your siblings. That's a lot to deal with. And then watching your daughter not have to do that. It's you're being tugged. You're like, oh, I want to be so happy for her because she doesn't have to live through that. But then you're like, what about me? What about
Mhm.
my 6-year-old? That's
Right.
tough.
So children developmentally, they don't have the awareness to be able to separate themselves from situations around them. And so children will make everything that happens around them because of them. And so to my 6-year-old, and for a lot of my life, I felt that my dad left because of something about me. It wasn't because my parents' marriage fell apart. It wasn't because of what happened between the two of them. It was because I wasn't good enough. I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't helpful enough. Whatever it was because I wasn't enough and my dad left. And that stuck with me. And I see that with my clients as well, is that you have this core memory of something that happened and you made it about yourself, not because you're egotistical. I mean, as a child, you are egotistical. That is developmentally appropriate. You think it's all about you. And that is something that we work through with my clients in identifying that this thing happened, but now we have to put that responsibility down. It wasn't because of you.
Yeah. You already have the pressure of being the oldest and that striving to be the best version that you can be to make things easier on your parents. And then you add that whole dynamic of divorce. So I could only imagine having to like take away that idea of perfection. I see it in so many firstborns that
Mhm.
strive for perfection and then you're getting the added pressure. So I could, yeah, I could only imagine what that was like. That's tough.